Hey guys, tonight we time travel to a place that gave the world democracy, drama, and at least three philosophers who probably would have told you to stop complaining about your life. Welcome to Classical Athens. But don't get too excited, because while Plato may have had big ideas, he definitely didn't invent plumbing, breakfast, or deodorant. You're not waking up in a sunlit marble villa. No. Your eyes open to the grayish haze of a clay-walled room, walls cracked from a recent tremor, and the gentle snoring of 6 other people, plus a goat that shouldn't be there but is. You slept on a straw mat so thin it legally counts as a suggestion, covered by a wool blanket that's seen too many winters and not enough baths. The good news, you're alive in the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. The bad news, so are your fleas. You sit up, stretching carefully. Your back protests. Your nose is assaulted by the mixture of sweat, ash, and someone else's feet. And you remember there's no such thing as coffee. That bitter brew won't be invented for another 500 years. Instead, you'll start your day with tepid barley water, if you're lucky, or just gnaw on a hunk of stale bread and pretend that's enough. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, because we're definitely not in Kansas anymore. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wrap yourself in your only chiton, basically a bed sheet held together by hope and 2 pins, no buttons, no zippers, just gravity and Greek optimism. Shoes optional, most likely. You'll go barefoot through a city that's 60% stone, 40% mystery substances you'd rather not investigate. Also, sidewalks haven't been invented yet. Neither has garbage collection. Your house, it's made of mud brick and barely insulated. In winter, it's freezing. In summer, it's an oven. Windows are tiny slits, great for keeping thieves out, but also fantastic at trapping heat and odor in. Privacy is a myth. You hear your cousin arguing in the next room? You also hear your cousin peeing. Through the wall, you push open the creaky wooden door and step into the dusty street. It's barely dawn. And already, the city is awake, shouting merchants, clanging pots, roosters on a broken loop. You duck to avoid a low-hanging beam and nearly trip over a beggar asleep in the doorway. He might be a philosopher. Hard to tell. And as the sun begins its daily assault on your retinas, you remember the first real task of the day, finding a place to pee. You step outside, clutching your dignity with the same fragile grip you used to hold your ill-fitting chiton together. The Athenian street greets you with its usual cocktail of dust, livestock droppings, human waste, and hope. The early sun glints off stone walls and bronze doors, at least the houses of people who matter. Yours mud brick and wood, humble enough to blend into the background of someone else's more interesting fresco. Your stomach reminds you it exists with a soft gurgle of protest. But before we talk about eating, we need to solve a more urgent human problem: where to relieve yourself. Spoiler alert, it's not behind closed doors with a scented candle. In classical Athens, the idea of private indoor plumbing is still hanging out in the future fantasy aisle. Toilets are either communal pits or chamber pots emptied into the street. Yes, the street. The whole city is basically a surprise obstacle course for anyone who isn't watching where they step. There's no polite knock or flushing sound. No scented soap pump by the sink. No sink either. What you get instead is a small clay pot, or if you're outside, a quick duck into an alley where you try to act casual while doing something deeply undignified. Toileting here is both an individual sport and a public event. You try to avoid eye contact with your neighbor, who's also squatting 6 feet away. And don't even think about toilet paper. The Greeks favored pebbles, smooth, flat, and, one hopes, recently washed in the sea. Some richer homes might have used bits of cloth, but that cloth would be reused, washed, and then reused again until it begged for mercy. You, being delightfully middle-class reed broke, get the pebbles. 3 of them, to be exact. That's the rule. Historians still argue whether this was a hygiene measure or an early mathematical joke. A gust of wind reminds you why open-roofed privies are not as poetic as Plato makes them sound. You brace yourself against the chill, swat at a fly, and count your blessings that you're not emptying the household chamber pot today. That task falls to your younger brother, whose dreams of being a hoplite are currently drowned in the slosh of last night's barley stew runoff. You scurry back inside, trying not to think about what just splashed onto your ankle. Your mat still smells faintly like goat, and the air is thick with the funk of 8 unbathed humans who share a living space smaller than a modern walk-in closet. The term personal space will not be coined for millennia. Now, let's say you're a woman in Athens. Things just got worse. You're either kept mostly indoors, restricted to the back section of the home, the gymnasium, or you're fetching water, grinding grain, and hoping your father doesn't marry you off before your next birthday. If you're lucky, you're ignored. If you're unlucky, you're a pawn in a dowry transaction involving sheep and someone named Nicandros who smells like pickled olives. And even the most elegant symposium goer, the smooth-talking Athenian elite waxing poetic about virtue and truth, still has to answer nature's call in a way that would horrify a modern-day park ranger. There are no status exemptions when it comes to peeing in a pot. But at least you're done now. You've completed the morning's most intimate task, and you did it with style, if style includes crouching behind a shrub with a handful of river stones. You step back into the street, nostrils flaring at the stew of smells wafting up from sun-heated waste and old fish. Somewhere, a dog howls. Somewhere else, a vendor yells about cucumbers. The day has barely started, and already you've learned 2 valuable truths. 1. Athens smells worse than it philosophizes, and 2. Indoor plumbing is mankind's greatest invention. Your stomach growls again, loud enough that an old man shuffling by gives you a look that says either, "You should have eaten earlier," or, "You're a disgrace to the agora." Or maybe that's just his normal face. In any case, it's time for breakfast. That word might conjure visions of warm bread, eggs, maybe even coffee, but classical Athens has no intention of spoiling you. You start with some barley porridge, again, because you started with it yesterday and the day before, and you'll probably die face first in it someday. The Greeks called it maza, and it's essentially ground barley meal moistened with water or wine. If you're feeling fancy, you might throw in a few herbs, a drizzle of olive oil, or a bit of honey if the bees are generous, and your wallet isn't gasping for air. Today, the bees were stingy. It's you, the barley, and your imagination. You chew, and chew, and chew. Maza isn't just a food, it's a dental endurance test. Bread, when you can afford it, is made with a kind of stone-ground flour so coarse that archaeologists have found ancient Greek skulls with teeth ground down like worn marble steps. It's not bread so much as weaponized sandstone. There's a scholarly debate about whether the Athenian diet was genuinely nourishing or just slowly sanding their molars into oblivion. Water hilarious. You drink kykion, a diluted wine water mix that also sometimes includes grated goat cheese, barley flour, or herbs. It's the kind of drink that sounds like a punishment in a reality cooking show. But it's less about flavor and more about survival. Athenian water wasn't always safe, especially if it came from open cisterns. There's a reason wine was diluted with water and not the other way around. Alcohol kills germs. or at least numbs you to their consequences. You look across the cramped kitchen area, kitchen being a generous word for a fire pit and some clay pots, and see your uncle attempting to pickle onions in a ceramic jug. This is your one shot at flavor today. If he doesn't spill the brine again. Lunch and dinner. Yes, they're basically the same thing, will be boiled lentils. Again. With a generous pinch of pessimism. Maybe a fig, maybe not. Meat is rare and usually reserved for sacrifices to the gods or the upper class. You, a mortal of no particular divine standing, may get lucky once a month if a festival rolls around and someone drops a charred bone your way. And don't expect a dessert tray. The ancient Greek sweet tooth was tamed by honey when available, or dried fruits when not infested with bugs. Grapes, great if they're not half rotten. Cheese, excellent if your family hasn't pawned the goat. Still chewing, you watch a boy in the street chase a chicken. He loses. The chicken sprints off, like it knows its life depends on it, which, frankly, it does. You wonder if you could catch that chicken. You probably couldn't. Your sandals are made of straw, and your knees still hurt from squatting earlier. Even your dreams are hungry. You remember when you first arrived in Athens, hoping for philosophical enlightenment and democracy. What you got was flatbread and intestinal uncertainty. Still, you swallow the last mouthful of maza and try to be grateful. It doesn't kill you, and that's worth something. You try to imagine Socrates eating the same breakfast, but you stop because imagining Socrates licking barley mush off his fingers is unsettling. And here's the twist for all its hunger. This diet keeps you alive longer than you'd think. It's low fat, high fiber, and impressively vegetarian. Modern dietitians might call it clean eating. They can try it, if they like. For you, it's just Tuesday. You thought you were done suffering after breakfast, cute. It's time to get dressed, and if you were hoping for warmth, dignity, or maybe just a clean tunic that doesn't itch, like it was woven by malicious spiders, well, allow Athens to disappoint you. You reach for your chiton, a rectangular slab of linen, or, worse, wool, folded and pinned over one shoulder like a toga that's given up. It's stiff with salt from yesterday's sweat. And the day before that, and the day before that, laundry is something rich people worry about. You have the sun, a stream, and the eternal scent of damp goat. The fabric rubs against your skin with all the grace of sandpaper. Wool might seem warm, but when it's unwashed, coarsely spun, and clingy in the wrong places, it feels like you're being slowly exfoliated to death. Oh, and the color, brownish, or grayish, possibly purple if you've spilled old wine on it recently, which would honestly be an upgrade. Let's not forget shoes. You've got carbotina leather sandals that amount to little more than foot-shaped regrets. They flap as you walk, slapping the ground like they disapprove of your choices. The leather is cracked, hardened by the Athenian sun, and thinner than your patience. Step on a pebble and your soul exits your body through your heel. Historians still argue whether the poor really wore shoes consistently or just hardened their feet, which is academic speak for suffered quietly. And because you only own one outfit, everything clings dirt, smoke, olive oil, yesterday's regrets. You might think, why not wash it? And to that we say, with what water? With what soap? And what do you wear while it dries? The gods answer only in riddles. It's summer. You're sweating. The fabric sticks to you like a desperate ex. Winter. That same cloth turns into a soggy wind trap. No insulation, no lining, and certainly no fur unless lice count. And they do. You scratch again. They say some Athenian homes had pets. Yours do. Too, they just live in your tunic and dine on your misery. Underwear. Adorable idea. Maybe a loincloth, if you're lucky. But really, Your chitin does double-duty clothes and undergarment in one fabulous, friction-rich package. Try not to trip when you squat, or walk, or breathe too deeply. Now, imagine trying to run from a stampeding goat herd in this thing. That happened last week. You limped home like a toga-wrapped burrito, minus the delicious part. Still, clothing isn't entirely without social nuance. Rich men wear crisp, bleached chitins that look almost white a miracle. Frankly, while yours is more the color of sadness, women's clothes. Meanwhile, add even more fabric because modesty means slowly suffocating under layers of scratchy wool. And let's not forget there are no buttons, zippers, or elastic. Just pins. Bronze pins. Which stab? You don't wear your clothes. You survive them. Yet. Like everything in Athens, even fashion is a public performance. Walking through the agora, people judge you by your fabric's drape, your cleanliness, and whether your robe rides up like you just rolled out of a ditch. You did. You adjust your sash. It doesn't help. You're still wearing a rectangle of sadness. And so you trudge on, sweaty, itchy, mildly stabbed by your shoulder pin, feet flapping like a fish on a boat deck, and wondering how anyone ever philosophized through this fabric. But hey, at least you're dressed. And in ancient Athens, that's half the battle. The other half is not bursting into flames from sheer discomfort. Your teeth hurt. Not in a maybe I should see a dentist next week kind of way. No, this is a chronic dull, pulsating ache that feels like your molars are trying to tunnel out of your jawbone just to escape the hellscape that is your mouth. Welcome to oral hygiene in classical Athens, an experience best described as optional and regrettable. You wake up with a sour taste that even vinegar would find offensive. No minty toothpaste, no floss, no electric toothbrush humming you into dental bliss. You have twigs, maybe a frayed stick of miswak if you're lucky, or a chewed olive branch if you're not. You rub it against your teeth, but it's like trying to clean a barbecue grill with a damp napkin. Your gums inflamed, swollen, bleeding if you so much as think about biting into a date. One sneeze away from full-on gingivitis. You can't even see inside your mouth mirrors or a rich person's flex, and you're still borrowing water from your neighbor's clay jug. So when a tooth starts wobbling, it's a surprise you'll feel with your tongue, over and over again, like a child checking a loose baby tooth. Except you're 28. Congratulations, you're elderly by Athenian standards. And what happens when the pain becomes unbearable? Easy. You go to the local iatros, a doctor who might also double as a barber, priest, or goat milker, depending on the economy. He pulls out his tool rusty pliers if you're lucky, his bare fingers if you're not. No anesthesia, no countdown. He just yanks. Blood gushes. You scream. The neighbors applaud your bravery, or maybe they're just happy it's not their turn. Historians still argue whether ancient Athenians had any concept of infection control. Spoiler, they didn't. Tools are wiped on tunics, maybe dipped in wine, the ancient Greek version of Purell, and reused before your blood is even dry. You stagger home, cradling your face, and someone hands you a dried fig. You can't eat it to eat. You want to, but your mouth is now a crater of regret. You sip lukewarm wine instead, part numbing agent, part ancient mouthwash, part oops. Now I'm day drunk at 11 a.m. Let's talk cavities. Sugar's rare, but honey is everywhere. It clings to your teeth like sweet doom. Without brushing, decay settles in quickly. You try to scrape it off with your nail, but mostly you just end up bleeding. Fun fact, ancient Athenians believed bad breath came from an imbalance of bodily humors, which, in fairness, is technically true if you consider rotting mouth meat a humor, and halitosis. Oh, honey, it's not a social embarrassment, it's a social norm. Everyone's breath smells like a fermented cheese plate left on a windowsill for a week. You're not the exception, you're the rule. Even Plato probably stank. Pythagoras absolutely reeked. But the philosophers had the advantage of talking about pain while you're stuck in it. Ever tried to smile with one side of your jaw locked in agony? It looks less like friendliness and more like a man contemplating betrayal. You keep your lips pressed shut, not for manners, but because if you open your mouth too wide, something important might fall out. And if you think you can just push through the pain, let me introduce you to dental abscesses, the ancient Greek version of Russian roulette. A swollen lump appears near your molars. It hurts, it festers. It either explodes or it kills you. There's no in between. And don't expect help, leeching won't fix it. And prayers to Asclepius bounce off the marble ceiling like spam emails from Olympus. On good days, you chew with the left side. On bad days, you just sip broth and cry softly into your robe. But, hey, your neighbors probably didn't make it past 35 either. Misery loves company. And in Athens, there's always someone nearby with a worse mouth than yours, or fewer teeth. You rise early. Not because you're ambitious, but because the rooster 3 houses down doesn't understand the concept of personal boundaries or sleep. The Athenian sun, still low, already scorches the tips of your shoulders, and you know today will be just like yesterday and the day before, and every day since you could hold a clay jug without dropping it. Welcome to labor in classical Athens, where dreams go to die in a plowed field. There's no such thing as weekends, or holidays, or sick days. There's just the field, the vineyard, or the workshop, and you, dragging your body across a job that started when you were 5 years old and will end when your spine finally folds in on itself, like a scroll. You're a farmer, probably. Roughly 70% of Athenians are. Which means your office is a patch of dry land. Your tools are wooden, and your coworkers are donkeys. You hoe, plow, water, harvest, and repeat. No plowing playlists, no ergonomic handles. Just your bare hands and the eternal threat of blisters turning into infections. And if you're not a farmer, congratulations, you're something equally exhausting. A potter, maybe, endlessly spinning clay while inhaling dust until your lungs become miniature amphorae. Or a stonemason, chiseling marble in sandals with no ear protection. Every strike against the rock is a note in the symphony of eventual hearing loss. Historians still argue whether Athenian craftsmen used protective head wraps or just accepted deafness as a kind of civic pride. Women, of course, are not exempt from this relentless treadmill. You might think your life is hard until you realize your wife just spent 4 hours grinding grain by hand, kneeling on stone, then scrubbed pots with sand, breastfed your child, and is now weaving an entire cloak from scratch using only a wooden loom and the last of her patience. Oh, and she still has to cook dinner, which is, ironically, a stale barley cake and a boiled onion. Again. And your kids. No time for hoplite cosplay. They're out collecting firewood, herding goats, or helping in the shop. Education is a luxury. Childhood is a rumor. Go play translates roughly to go fetch water and don't spill it this time. You take your lunch standing, maybe sitting on a rock, but mostly standing. Bread that breaks more than it bends. Olives that taste like betrayal. A little wine, diluted so heavily it's mostly sadness. And then it's back to work because your body doesn't own itself. The city, the land, and the season do. And when war comes, and it always does, you don't get a draft notice. You get a spear. If you're male, you are the infantry. No training montage. No Spartan fitness coach. Just a helmet and the hope that your neighbor, who still owes you a goat, doesn't panic and break formation. If you survive the phalanx, you're rewarded with more work. You limp home to rebuild what got burned. You rebuild your house, your fence, your life. And then the tax man shows up to collect war reparations. which is Athenian for we lost a battle and you have a fig tree. So pay up. On bad days, your tools break. On worse days, your body does. Your knees click like castanets. Your back spasms when you sneeze. And your hands are so calloused they could scratch pottery. There's no physio, no chiropractor, just whine and denial. You wonder, briefly, if philosophers have it easier. But then you remember even Socrates had to walk barefoot everywhere and died drinking poison. You're better off with your hoe. Your entire life is a loop sunrise. Work, whine, collapse, repeat. You're not building a future. You're maintaining survival with no savings, no health care, and no exit strategy except death by exhaustion. By now, you probably expect nature to take it easy on you. After all, you've already survived stale bread, calloused hands, and a neighbor with aggressive body odor. But classical Athens doesn't believe in mercy, because now you face the real tyrant of daily life, the weather. It is not your friend. It is not your backdrop. It is your full-time enemy. Let's start with summer. You wake before dawn, hoping for cool air, but it's already like being smothered by a wool blanket dipped in sweat. The stone walls of your home trap the heat with alarming enthusiasm, like they're working on commission. There are no fans, no air conditioning, not even a handheld paper fan, unless you count waving a fig leaf and praying for a breeze. You sweat. Constantly. Until you forget what it feels like to be dry. And then come the insects. Oh, the insects. Flies, ants, and mosquitoes view your body like a 5-star buffet. They bite, buzz, and burrow with unmatched enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether Athenians used olive oil, smoke, or sheer willpower to keep them away. All we know is whatever they did, it didn't work. When winter rolls around, you naively believe it might bring relief. It doesn't. The wind howls through the cracks in your house, and you lie awake under a scratchy blanket made of goat hair, wondering if your toes will still be attached by morning. Spoiler, they are. But they're not happy about it. There's no fireplace, just a brazier. A small metal bowl filled with embers that warms your room about as effectively as a candle warms a canyon. Snow is rare, but possible. Cold rain is not. And when it hits, the city turns into a mud-slathered slip and slide. Your sandals, if you have them, squish and suck at the muck like they're trying to escape your feet. And the roads, they're not roads. They're vaguely flattened goat trails lined with philosophical regret and goat droppings. Clothing doesn't help much. Your hymation, essentially a toga's scrappy cousin, is either too thin to block the cold or too thick to survive the heat. There's no layering. There's no seasonal wardrobe swap. It's just you, sweating in wool or shivering in linen, wondering what personal decisions brought you to this miserable moment. If you're wealthy, you might have 2 cloaks, maybe even sandals with straps. If you're not, well, try not to trip over the frayed hem of your single. All-season disappointment of a garment? You might think staying indoors is the solution, but homes aren't insulated, or waterproof, or pest-proof. They're glorified boxes with 0 ventilation in summer and negative insulation in winter. Your home is either a kiln or a cave, and you never get to pick which. Your body suffers. In the heat, you get dizzy and nauseous, possibly heat stroke. But there's no thermometer to confirm that. In the cold, your joints ache, your skin cracks, and your teeth chatter like castanets performing a nervous solo. Ancient medical texts suggest treatments like walking briskly or rubbing thyme oil into your limbs. Spoiler, these do nothing except make you smell vaguely like dinner. Festivals don't stop for the weather. Neither do wars. Neither does work. You plow in the sun. You carry amphorae in the rain. You run errands during dust storms. There's no weather app, no forecast, no planning. Only looking at the sky, shrugging, and doing it anyway. Nature isn't background ambiance. It's an active player in your daily suffering, and it always, always has the final word. Water source of life, healer of the thirsty, bather of bodies. In classical Athens, it's also a slot machine where every sip might come with a bonus parasite. You wake up, throat dry as terracotta, and dream of a glass of clean, cold water instead. You're handed a clay cup of murky liquid that smells like a philosophical debate between mildew and regret. Most Athenians got their water from public fountains fed by aqueducts or cisterns. Sounds elegant, doesn't it? Until you see the long lines, the occasional dead rat floating nearby, and the man ahead of you rinsing his armpits in the stream like it's his personal spa. Historians still argue whether Athens' water system was truly revolutionary or just a wet version of herd immunity. That's the way you're And you don't drink water straight unless you're courting danger or intestinal betrayal. The safer route, mixing it with wine. Not because you're a connoisseur, but because wine kills germs, sort of. Your options are get tipsy or get typhoid. So, every child, grandma, and goat herder sips diluted wine daily and calls it a lifestyle. As for bathing, oh, you innocent modern being bathing is not your daily refreshment ritual. It's a carefully orchestrated gamble, performed maybe once a week if you're lucky, and once a festival cycle, if you're normal. And it involves communal public baths. Picture this: a crowded marble room filled with steam, old men arguing about Plato, and a suspicious brown streak no one wants to claim. Soap. Try olive oil. You smear it on, scrape it off with a striggle, a curved metal tool resembling a torture device, and pretend it's cleansing. You feel slightly less dusty, slightly more oily, and thoroughly confused about personal hygiene standards. Modern dermatologists would faint. Private baths. Only the rich have them. And even then, they're glorified buckets. For the rest, you squat over a clay basin while your friend pours lukewarm water on your shoulders from an amphora. If you have no friends, you remain crusty. But wait. You say, what about rain? Surely people collect it. Absolutely. It pools in barrels, jars, and occasionally your sandals. It's also full of roof dust, bird droppings, and insects that didn't RSVP to your hydration plans. Now, try washing clothes. You lug them to the nearest stream, slap them against rocks, and hope the gods grant you mercy. They usually don't. Your garments come back clean, in the same way a reused napkin is clean. But hey, at least now they smell like algae. Waterborne diseases are a constant threat. Dysentery, cholera, and parasites dance invisibly in every puddle. The term epidemic may not have had emojis back then, but it did have mass funerals. Scholars still debate whether Athenians understood waterborne transmission or just thought Hera was punishing them for skipping offerings. And here's the kicker, despite all this. Athenians considered water sacred. Rivers had spirits. Springs had nymphs. You couldn't defile a fountain without offending a minor deity who might curse your crops or your complexion. So yes, you might die from drinking the water, but you better do it respectfully. So now it's evening. You're sticky, dehydrated, slightly fermented from all that diluted wine, and eyeing a jug of water like it's a loaded crossbow. Do you risk it? Do you try to wash your feet before sleep and risk opening your soul to demon pox? You do what everyone does. You mumble a prayer to Poseidon, sip cautiously, and hope your stomach doesn't riot before sunrise. And now, finally, we arrive at the grand finale of your survival saga. The sun is down. Your limbs are sore, and all you want is peace, preferably with some clean water and a functioning immune system. Unfortunately, neither is guaranteed in classical Athens. You lie on your straw mat, itchy from lice, half drunk from safety wine, and realize the only thing more dangerous than life in the agora is going to sleep with the wrong kind of water in your gut. Because while air may be free and inconsistent, and food may be terrible but solid, water is that silent threat always circling. The well might be dry, the cistern might be cracked, your neighbor might have washed his goat in the public fountain again, and now your stomach is staging a full-blown rebellion at midnight. Good luck. You curl up tighter. You try to remember the last time you weren't damp in some way sweat. Dew, oil, wine, mystery drizzle from a neighbor's roof. Your tunic smells like fermented olives and regret. Outside, someone coughs. You hope it's not the plague. Historians still argue whether the Athenian plague was typhus, typhoid, smallpox, or divine punishment. Whatever it was, you don't want it, especially not from a communal ladle. But your body aches. Your mind wanders. And slowly, the chaos fades. You picture rain falling gently over the Acropolis, trickling through ancient streets, humming softly in the clay gutters. For a moment, it almost sounds like peace. Like maybe you'll survive this day. Maybe. And then your bladder reminds you that risky sip of water at supper, it's ready to exit. You groan. No indoor plumbing, remember. So you shuffle outside in the dark, trying not to step in what someone else already left behind. The public latrine is a good 30 steps away, but you can't tell what's more dangerous, tripping over a sleeping dog or squatting over a communal bench in the pitch black. You reach it. It smells like a moral warning. The marble seat is slick with something ancient. You don't ask questions. You hover. You survive. Barely. Back in bed. You finally close your eyes for real. And this time, no philosophical debates echo in the street. Just silence. And maybe a faint breeze through the shutters. The moon glows above a city full of thinkers, soldiers, farmers, and one out-of-time visitor who made it through exactly one brutal day. You did it. Congratulations. You didn't thrive. But you didn't die either. And in ancient Athens, that's basically a festival-worthy achievement. Now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax and your thoughts drift far from the dusty roads of Athens. Picture a quiet hillside outside the city. The olive trees swaying gently in the night air, and the stars glimmering like distant torches. Let your skin forget the scratchy linen, your lungs forget the smoky cook fires, and your feet forget the endless walking. There's no more rationed wine to sip, no more public latrine to avoid, just quiet, calm, and the certainty that you're no longer expected to barter for clean drinking water or explain Socratic logic to a drunk neighbor. The ancient world fades like mist, and all you're left with is the soft comfort of your own bed, hopefully without fleas. Close your eyes. You've earned it now. We creep into a kitchen filled with steam, tension, and the faint aroma of fear-braised pheasant. You're not in a restaurant. You're in the gilded belly of Versailles, where the chandeliers drip crystals, but the soup might drip cyanide. You would never think that the royal dinner menu might double as a murder plot. But welcome to 17th century France, where every mouthful could be your last. And the cheese course comes with existential dread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and local time. I want to know who else is up this late, thinking about powdered wigs and poison. Now back to the kitchen, where the real drama begins. You trudge through the copper and silver jungle of Versailles' royal kitchen, where over 200 cooks, assistants, sauciers, and official napkin folders bustle in carefully choreographed chaos. You're here to meet one man, the king's personal chef. His apron is pristine, his smile is tight, and under his powdered wig, he sweats like a fugitive in church. Cooking for Louis XIV isn't a culinary honor. It's a high-stakes gamble. The Sun King eats 6 meals a day, flanked by courtiers who rank higher than most European nobles. His palate refined, his patience non-existent, and his enemies numerous. That's why the palace employs an official goûteur, a royal taster, whose job is to eat everything before the king does. Not to check for seasoning, to check for sudden death. The taster is always young, always terrified, and always 2 bites away from martyrdom by tart. One mainstream fact here: Louis XIV's court demanded extreme ceremony at every meal. Forks had to be polished to a blinding gleam. Dishes were presented by rank. Even salt placement was symbolic. But beneath that silver-plated calm was a roiling paranoia. Poison was the silent killer of the elite clean, discreet, fashionable. And while the king's enemies plotted, his chef chopped onions with sweaty hands, hoping no one had slipped anything extra into the spice jars. A fringe tidbit: the kitchen staff kept a cat, not for mice, but allegedly to test leftovers. If it purred, the meal was safe. If it staggered, dinner was canceled. The cat's name was apparently Biscotte. Historians still argue whether biscotti was real or an invented scapegoat for overcooked lamb. That brings us to the strange dance of Versailles food safety. The chef had to know every delivery man, every servant, every herb. The basil smelled funny, toss the soup. If the butter looked too golden, start over. One anonymous chef supposedly boiled his own fingernails into a broth to fake aroma complexity. Was it brilliant? Was it madness? Was it both? And yet, amid the risk and performance, the dishes were stunning. Roast larks wrapped in pastry, glazed boar with candied oranges, eggs sculpted into swans, each dish a masterpiece, and each bite a dare. As you lie there tonight, full of snacks, far less dramatic, picture this: a palace kitchen where a spoonful could start a war, a tart could topple a minister, and a very nervous taster could become famous for exactly 1 terrifying second. Sleep well, and maybe skip the leftovers. You trudge into a dim-lit Soviet kitchen, where the walls feel like they're listening and even the potatoes have trust issues. This isn't just any government building. It's Stalin's personal dining room. Tucked deep in the Kremlin, you would never think soup could be an act of national security. But under Joseph Stalin, even borscht required background checks. At the center of this culinary Cold War stands a man named Spiridon Putin. Yes, that Putin, grandfather of the one you're thinking of. Spiridon was the personal chef to one of the 20th century's most terrifying dictators. He cooked for him, tasted for him, and survived him, which in Stalin's orbit practically made him a warlock. Each morning, Spiridon received fresh ingredients every tomato, beet, and cutlet checked by armed guards and peeled under supervision. He was trusted not because he was special, but because he'd lasted longer than most cutlery. And his secret, keep it bland. Stalin didn't like surprises, especially not in his food. One mainstream fact: Stalin's deep paranoia extended into the kitchen. Meals were carefully monitored, and food tasters sampled every dish before it reached the leader. Sometimes the food was served cold, not as a style choice, but because no one wanted to rush through a possibly poisoned lunch. Fringe lore claims Spiridon once boiled a cabbage soup so aggressively flavorless that Stalin called it the food of a pure man. Historians still argue whether this was sincere praise or a coded threat. Either way, the soup kept flowing, and so did the fear. You stand near Spiridon's station. He chops with mechanical precision, as though over-seasoning might trigger a purge. Behind him, another man takes notes. Not for a cookbook, for the NKVD. The secret police had informants everywhere, even in the pantries. Stalin's favorite foods were deceptively rustic grilled meats, pickled vegetables, and Georgian dishes like carcho, heavy with garlic and walnut. But garlic had to be measured. Too much and it was subversion. Too little and it was sabotage. Spiridon cooked with the restraint of a monk and the stress level of a bomb technician. Sometimes, entire dinners were thrown out if a single dish caused suspicion. One fringe account describes a guest coughing. During dessert, Stalin immediately stopped the meal, left the room, and had the cake burned. Not discarded. Burned. You would never think custard required a controlled incineration. But here we are, and through it all, Spiridon stayed silent. He lived modestly, avoided politics, and retired with all his limbs and zero public comments. A survivor, a quiet ghost in the kitchen. So, as you slip deeper into rest, imagine being a man who stirs soup like it's statecraft, who seasons with trembling hands and never tastes without flinching. A man whose legacy, bizarrely, ends up woven into modern geopolitics, and all because he knew when not to add salt. You wake up in the middle of a battlefield, not dodging bullets, but breadcrumbs. There's cannon fire in the distance, soldiers groaning nearby, and in the center of the chaos, a man frantically foraging tomatoes. This is not a hallucination. This is Napoleon Bonaparte's cook, minutes after the Battle of Marengo, trying to summon victory through chicken. You would never think that empire and culinary improvisation would collide. But when Napoleon ran out of provisions and patience, his chef cobbled together history's most over-romanticized stew, chicken marengo. Here's the mainstream version. In June 1800, Napoleon defeats Austrian forces in northern Italy. Supplies are a mess. The situation is frantic, and the emperor is hungry, famously cranky when unfed. His cook, Dunand, reportedly raids the nearest farm and conjures a dish with chicken, garlic, tomatoes, eggs, and because why not crawfish and fried bread?
Napoleon allegedly loved it so much, he demanded it after every victory, which is great, except scholars can't agree if any of that actually happened.
Historians still argue whether chicken marengo was battlefield brilliance or post-war propaganda. Some say it was invented later by a chef trying to name-drop his way into a cookbook deal. Others insist the emperor's ego was so massive, it needed a dish to match. Either way, the stew became legend, and it wasn't just the ingredients that sparked confusion. One fringe account claims Napoleon insisted the recipe never change, not even a pinch of pepper. Why, he was superstitious. Altering the meal might alter his fate. So, in one of history's weirder rituals, France's most feared general dined like it was June 1800 for years. But let's pause and picture it a war-torn field. A few plucked chickens, a desperate man boiling garlic in puddle water, all while troops bury the dead. And somewhere nearby, Napoleon is yelling about toast. This is the surreal genius of food politics. You don't just win battles, you eat them. You chew them into memory. And then, if you're powerful enough, you turn your leftovers into symbols. Chicken marengo wasn't just dinner. It became shorthand for imperial resilience. The French elite started serving it at parties, a savory reminder that glory could be garnished with crustaceans. Later versions swapped the crawfish for mushrooms because modern people are cowards, but the dish's association with glory persisted. Of course, Dunand the cook didn't retire wealthy or immortal. He kept cooking, mostly in silence, while his dish got famous without him. Somewhere in France, a ghostly chef is still muttering about underpaid overtime. And while Napoleon went on to more battles, more triumphs, and one highly inconvenient exile, chicken marengo clung to his legacy like parsley on a plate. So as you tuck in and drift away, consider this history might remember generals and their cannons, but sometimes it's the man with a skillet and a chicken who really sets the tone. And next time someone complains about what's for dinner, just say, could be worse. You could be cooking under cannon fire. You kneel on polished wood, inside a palace so quiet. Even the chopsticks whisper. This is the imperial court of Japan, early 20th century, and dinner is more ceremony than sustenance. You're here not to eat, but to obey. And standing beside you is the emperor's chef, holding a ladle like a sacred relic. He's not just cooking, he's conducting ritual. You would never think that eel could carry political weight, but in Hirohito's Japan, one grilled fish might represent centuries of divine ancestry and a smoldering empire on the edge of modern war. By tradition, Japan's emperor was a living god, or at least, he had to eat like one. Meals weren't built for taste. They were built for symbolism. Simplicity wasn't just a style, it was law. A single misplaced garnish could be seen as cosmic disrespect. One mainstream historical fact, Emperor Hirohito's meals were bound by Shinto ritual. Certain dishes were offered to ancestral deities before they ever reached his plate. Foods were seasonal, locally sourced, and meticulously arranged for spiritual balance. No one seasoned freely. Soy sauce had boundaries. Salt had meaning. Ginger was basically a holy spice. And amid this culinary pressure cooker, the emperor's chefs functioned more like monks than cooks. One fringe tale speaks of a chef dismissed not for poisoning, not for rebellion, but for steaming the sacred rice with water drawn from the wrong well. Apparently, even the water had to be emotionally aligned. Historians still argue whether these strictures were deeply spiritual or just bureaucratic perfectionism disguised as tradition. But the chefs complied because one misstep meant exile or worse, being transferred to the fish smoking unit with no ventilation. Eel, or unagi, was particularly important. Grilled in summer, it symbolized resilience, endurance, and national identity. It was also the emperor's favorite, but it had to be prepared over white charcoal by one of 3 elite chefs certified to flip imperial protein. One record describes a banquet where the eel was slightly overglazed. A hush fell across the table. Nobody died, but someone fainted. Possibly from fear, possibly from flavor. Either way, it was noted in the palace, ledger eel, intense. In private, Hirohito reportedly preferred simple meals, plain rice, pickled plum, a sliver of fish. He rarely spoke during dinner, and if he didn't finish his food, no one asked why. Leftovers were removed like failed policies quietly, efficiently, and without eye contact. One rumor holds that the emperor once stopped eating mid-meal during World War II. Not from protest, not from illness, but because a rice grain had fallen out of alignment. Was this restraint? Was it trauma? Was it gastrointestinal symbolism? Scholars still don't know. But someone definitely rewrote the rice layout protocol afterward. So now, as your eyes begin to close, imagine the calm horror of feeding a deity who never gives feedback, who doesn't smile, and whose silence is both terrifying and final. And if you're ever asked to prepare dinner for someone with their own era named after them, maybe start with toast. You stand in a dim kitchen that smells like boiled turnips and performative suffering. The tiles are clean but joyless, and outside, a giant poster of Mussolini stares into the void like he invented wheat. Welcome to fascist Italy, where the food isn't just bland, it's politically correct. And if you thought tyranny only came in uniforms and speeches, wait until you meet Mussolini's chef and his aggressively patriotic lentil stew. You would never think that a dictator could be obsessed with rustic peasant cuisine while secretly devouring cream puffs. But here we are. Mussolini, the self-styled man of the people, declared war on decadent food. Fancy meals were bourgeois. Imported ingredients were subversive. Garlic was a threat to national unity. The kitchen became a place where ideology boiled over faster than pasta. One mainstream fact: Mussolini promoted something called the autarky diet, urging Italians to eat only what the country produced. No exotic spices, no imported grains. Even pasta was temporarily condemned for not being Italian enough. Instead, he promoted polenta, chestnuts, and boiled vegetables. A food pyramid built entirely out of sadness, and who had to make that sound appetizing his personal chef, a man whose name is mostly lost to history, possibly on purpose. This chef crafted modest meals for public appearances, simple soups, stale bread, and what one aide called rural dignity in edible form. But one fringe tale claims that behind closed doors, Mussolini snacked on French pastries and fine prosciutto smuggled in by loyalists. Historians still argue whether these indulgences were rare lapses or the dictator's true tastes. Either way, the kitchen had two menus, the one for show and the one for when the photographers left. One day, a foreign ambassador visited and was served roasted chickpeas, a rock-hard bun, and wine that tasted like vinegar and punishment. Mussolini smiled and declared it the flavor of Rome's future. The ambassador nodded politely while texting his embassy for a sandwich in public. Mussolini's meals were theater. State photographers captured him eating plain bean soup at farmhouse tables. Everything was designed to say, "Look, I am like you. I choose sadness too." But in reality, his chef was balancing ideology with actual nutrition, because no amount of political messaging can cure scurvy. There's one curious account of the chef creating an entire banquet of colorless food, boiled cauliflower, pale beans, and flour dumplings because color was seen as frivolous. The result? An edible depression. Even the butter looked ashamed, and yet the chef survived by staying invisible, by never contradicting the illusion, by pretending that a spoonful of gray lentils was the height of civilization, So tonight, as you rest in a world where you can season without fear, remember some chefs cooked for kings, others cooked for the camera, and a few poor souls cooked for men who thought ideology could replace olive oil. You blink against the heat of the tandoor, only to hear the clink of fine silverware on porcelain plates imported from London. Welcome to British India, where the kitchens of colonial palaces were built on contradiction lavish, ornate, and absolutely terrified of flavor. You would never think that a chili pepper could start a diplomatic incident. But here, it was practically treason to cook with more than a whisper of spice. Behind the scenes, Indian chefs labored to produce curries so bland they bordered on performance art. The colonial elite liked the idea of Indian food, just not the taste, color, texture, or temperature. They wanted exotic without the indigestion. So the chefs translated masala into mush. Vindaloo became beige soup, and somewhere, turmeric wept softly in a clay jar. One mainstream fact during the British Raj: Indian cooks were often employed in elite colonial households, but forced to adjust traditional dishes to suit British palates, eliminating heat, layering cream over ghee, and reducing spice blends to what you might call sad paprika. Curry powder, as we know it, was born here not from heritage, but convenience and compromise. There's a fringe story of one chef in Lucknow who was reprimanded for using excessive cardamom. The official report described the meal as morally disruptive. Historians still argue whether these culinary decisions were diplomacy, control, or just a deep cultural misunderstanding wrapped in naan. The irony: while colonial governors nibbled cautiously on mashed mango with white rice, Indian nobility often dined on dishes so spicy they'd make modern foodies cry in 8 languages. Yet the chefs who could prepare those meals, the true masters of Mughlai and Awadhi cuisine, were often repurposed to make porridge. One such chef, once famous for crafting saffron biryanis for nawabs, ended up as the pudding expert at a British residency. His specialty: overboiled rice pudding with a single raisin. The raisin was later removed by request. The clash reached comical heights in formal banquets. There was a strict seating order, a fusion menu carefully planned by British hosts, and a silent agreement that nothing should smell too strongly of garlic. Chutneys were feared like smallpox. Guests once debated whether mangoes were a proper fruit or merely decorative. Meanwhile, the cooks whispered in the kitchen, wondering if mashed peas were truly worth colonization. And yet, amidst all this restraint, Indian chefs still found moments to reclaim dignity, folding in subtle touches a sprig of mint, a swirl of tamarind, a perfectly round chapati offered with the solemn grace of resistance. Sometimes, flavor snuck through. Sometimes, someone flinched from heat. And sometimes, a small victory was measured in a slightly toasted cumin seed. So tonight, while you lie under a blanket that smells more like detergent than cardamom, Think of those chefs, masters of spice, trapped in palaces of porridge. They translated culture into something palatable, then into something tolerable, and finally into something almost unrecognizable. And still, they cooked. You step into a palace gleaming with chandeliers and suspicion, where the marble floors shine brighter than most villages, and every bite might be your last. This is Saddam Hussein's Iraq opulence above ground, dread underneath, and the head chef is a man who can no longer smell cumin without flinching. You would never think a banquet could vanish untouched, but when the host is a dictator, no one's really hungry. The palace kitchens are stocked with everything lamb, saffron, rosewater, pine nuts, ingredients worthy of a Persian epic. But meals aren't planned around taste. They're planned around survival. Saddam dines alone, often at odd hours, and every dish must pass through a gauntlet of tasters, guards, and occasionally a chemist. One mainstream fact: Saddam employed food tasters not just as tradition, but as active defense. Dishes were rotated without warning. Menus were rewritten hourly. And even the most loyal staff didn't know which dish was going to be served until it already was. The head chef, a man rumored to have trained in both Paris and Baghdad, once confessed years later that he kept 3 versions of every entree in motion at all times. One for testing, one for decoy, one for the table. It was like a magic trick, except the magician had a history of executing assistants. One fringe story tells of a lavish feast, 20 dishes, ice sculptures, imported dates, gold leaf desserts, and not a single person touched a plate. It was all for show. The guests smiled, the dictator nodded, then the entire meal was quietly buried in the sand by morning. Historians still argue whether this was caution, theater, or the culinary version of a flex. The paranoia bled into ingredients. 2. Fish had to come from specific waters, rice from approved silos. Even salt was checked for unauthorized trace minerals. Spices were triple washed, as if conspiracy could hide in a cinnamon stick. The chef, meanwhile, lived in a gilded prison. Surveillance was constant. He once asked for new knives, just new knives, and was questioned for 2 hours. Why, they asked? What's wrong with the old knives? As if cutlery had formed an opposition party. Occasionally, Saddam himself would enter the kitchen, not to praise, not to taste, just to loom. Imagine stirring lentils while a dictator watches from behind a gold-framed mirror. And yet, through it all, the dishes were flawless. Fragrant kuzi with roasted nuts, crisp dolma, dates stuffed with almonds. These meals could have fed armies. Instead, they became stories, buried banquets whispered about by staff, who had seen too much and eaten too little. So as you drift off, tucked in a world where dinner isn't a loyalty test, think of that chef, a man who cooked masterpieces designed never to be eaten, a ghostwriter of taste, a prisoner of presentation, and above all, a survivor, because the real secret ingredient in that kitchen was fear. You crack open a cellar door and find carrots. So many carrots. Soft ones, steamed ones, pureed into gray-orange slush that smells like hospital sadness. You're in Adolf Hitler's Alpine retreat, and the woman behind the stove is his personal cook, resigned, silent, and deeply overqualified to be making bland root paste for a man responsible for global ruin. You would never think evil could be vegan, but here we are, elbow deep in vegetable broth and moral discomfort. Hitler was, infamously, a vegetarian in his later years. Not for health, not for love of animals, but for reasons historians still argue about. Was it obsession, PR, or a way to feel spiritually pure while orchestrating genocide? No one quite knows. But his meals were meatless, flavorless, and, frankly, terrifying for all the wrong reasons. The woman charged with making these dishes was Constanze Manziarli, a dietitian turned captive. Officially, she was hired to maintain the Führer's digestion. Unofficially, she was trapped in a nightmare pantry with a monster who hated seasoning and feared gas from cabbage. Mainstream fact, Hitler avoided meat, alcohol, and rich food in the latter part of his life. His daily meals often included mashed potatoes, boiled vegetables, and barley soup. It wasn't asceticism. It was part paranoia, part chronic stomach issues, and part twisted ideology about bodily purity. Manziarli worked under intense scrutiny. Every meal was checked, not just for poison, although yes, there were tasters, but for texture, aroma, even temperature. One fringe story claims Hitler once refused a soup for being too enthusiastic in smell. It was pumpkin. It wasn't invited back. She kept a meticulous diary, later referenced in post-war reports. It describes endless carrots, frequent retching sounds from the adjoining room, and an emotional numbness that settled in like stale steam. At one point, she noted lunch, potato balls, dried apple slices, salt not used. He smiled. Whether that was satisfaction or indigestion remains up for debate. Historians still argue whether Constanza was complicit, coerced, or simply surviving. Some see her as an enabler, others as a bystander too afraid to flee. One detail haunts: she vanished after Berlin fell, possibly trying to escape disguised as a nurse. Her body was never found. Back in the kitchen, the contradictions pile up. The cook wears a spotless apron while the city outside burns. She ladles out beet puree while officers discuss troop movements. Hitler drinks herbal tea while plotting death. It's like the universe is upside down. But the menu must go on. Even garlic was controversial. It wasn't banned, but it was mistrusted. Some accounts suggest Manziarli once slipped a trace amount into a stew and spent the night expecting execution. She wasn't killed, but she never used garlic again. So as your eyelids grow heavy, think of that quiet, haunted kitchen where no one laughed, where no one tasted freely, and where the greatest crimes in history were planned on a stomach full of lukewarm vegetable mash. Sometimes, the real horror isn't in the fire. It's in what's slowly boiling above it. You tiptoe now into a palace corridor, echoing with silver trays and empty plates. But these aren't just leftovers, they're monuments to something darker. These are the banquet halls of leaders who feasted while their people starved. You would never think that dessert could be a symbol of oppression. But when it's served with gold flakes during a famine, sugar becomes sinister. This is where luxury whispers its ugliest secrets. The chefs who cooked here weren't just culinary artists. They were unwitting curators of inequality, orchestrating absurd opulence for rulers who believed butter sculptures were more urgent than bread for the masses. Unmainstream truth history is full of autocrats who demanded exquisite food while entire regions went hungry. From Emperor Haile Selassie's opulent feasts in Ethiopia to the Shah of Iran's champagne-fueled state dinners, food became performance often for foreign guests, while locals rationed rice or survived on boiled weeds. Let's revisit a lesser-known example, King Leopold II of Belgium, whose dinner parties at the royal palace of Laeken were renowned for their elegance, imported delicacies, and river-chilled champagne. Meanwhile, in the Congo Free State, his personal colony, millions died under a brutal regime of forced labor and starvation. One fringe tale describes a Belgian pastry chef refusing to bake a cake shaped like the Congo River, saying it was bad luck. He was reportedly reassigned to poultry for the remainder of the tour. Historians still argue whether these chefs were silent collaborators or just too busy flambeing soufflés to rebel. In truth, many were both painfully aware, eerily silent, and entirely dispensable. One chef in North Korea was tasked with creating banquets of 14 courses for the Kim Dynasty, elaborate meals meant to impress diplomats, featuring rare seafood, imported French cheeses, and even wine decanted by hand. Meanwhile, in the countryside, famine was so severe that families resorted to foraging grass. The chef later defected and claimed that entire menus were copied from Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris and Tokyo, minus the soul. Plus the surveillance, another in Tsarist Russia carved butter swans, while peasant uprisings boiled outside the Winter Palace. His ice sculpture centerpiece of St. George slaying a dragon. It melted before dessert. A metaphor, if ever there was one. Even in more recent regimes, chefs have become symbols of the absurd gap between ruler and ruled. One dessert designer for a Middle Eastern royal family once built a chocolate pyramid taller than herself, complete with edible gold bricks. Afterward, it was photographed, untouched, and thrown away. The staff wasn't allowed to eat it. It was food as wallpaper. And through it all, the chefs said little. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of proximity to power. Because cooking for kings and dictators meant one thing above all: survival through silence. Now, your breathing slows. The flavors fade. The kitchen lights dim. And the clatter of dishes is replaced by the hush of memory. Picture those ghostly chefs still moving through marble halls, flipping omelets while revolutions brewed just outside the gate. Let it go now. No more powdered sugar palaces or golden lamb. No more fearful tasting spoons. Only the gentle hush of stories that have finally now. We slide into the snow-laced silence of a Viking longhouse, where the hearth crackles and a newborn's fate hangs quite literally by a thread of tradition. You think modern parenting is pressure? Try giving birth into a culture where your baby has to pass inspection by a council. Or, if you're unlucky enough to be Spartan, by the cold judgment of a cliffside. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, pop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where bedtime meets baby tribunals. You're in a smoky hall, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and fermented fish. A Viking baby's first cry doesn't earn a lullaby. It earns a legal pause. Because under Norse law, the child isn't truly part of the family until the father accepts it publicly, lifting it onto his knee in a ritual called taking to the knee. It's a symbolic act, sure, but also legally binding. Forget baby showers here. You're watching the newborn version of a corporate merger. Now, flip the saga southward to ancient Sparta, where babyhood was more of a tryout. The elders inspect the newborn like it's a questionable melon at the market. Is it strong, symmetrical breathing deeply enough? If not, the baby is, well, historians still argue whether the infants deemed unfit were thrown from Mount Taygetus or quietly left to perish by exposure. Either way, it's less diaper duty, more Darwin meets democracy. You would never think that tiny toes and soft whimpers could spark legal discourse. But here, infant survival is as much about legislation as lullabies. And here's where it gets even colder in Sparta. Babies weren't really considered family property. They were viewed as the property of the state, a kind of organic investment in future military dividends. They had no official names for days, sometimes weeks. Instead, they were the boy or the girl until approved by the council. The ultimate form of government gatekeeping, really. By contrast, Viking naming ceremonies, while less fatal, still carried heavy expectations. Children were named after dead relatives, usually warriors or landowners, which meant little baby Bjorn might be saddled from birth with the name of great uncle Bjorn who lit the outhouse on fire. One fringe tale tells of a child named after three ancestors at once, Thorgil's Eric Bloodsword. Try putting that on a wooden birth plaque. Historians still argue whether these brutal beginnings were practical rites of survival or just deeply embedded social performances, part tradition, part social control, part let's make sure the gods are watching. And if you're wondering how the mothers felt in Viking lands, they were often present for the ceremony, wrapped in fur and silent resolve. In Sparta, less so. Childbearing was their duty, but child-keeping, that was up to the state. Maternal bonding was secondary to military bonding. So as you tuck into bed tonight, just imagine being born into a world where your very first legal challenge is surviving your own birth announcement. No pressure. Little one, just don't blink the wrong way. You wake up in a Viking household built of timber, fur, and passive-aggressive goat smells. Father sharpens his axe on the doorstep. Mother negotiates land rights with a neighbor using a tone that could peel paint. And you're quietly realizing that this family setup comes with more legal nuance than a prenup drafted by Odin himself. In Viking society, the father is the official head of the household, the bondi legally responsible for property, livestock, and anyone under his roof who isn't actively throwing spears. He's the guy who settles disputes, signs the marriage contracts, and leads the family saga. But don't be fooled. The mother isn't just scrubbing potatoes in the corner. She's legally entitled to her own property, can initiate divorce, and wields a household key the size of small weaponry. And yes, that key is both metaphor and metal. Across the sea, Spartan women have somehow upgraded that model entirely. Here, you're looking at a society where wives not only inherit vast estates, they run them. Why? Because Spartan men are always off training, marching, or dying in impressively symmetrical formations. Someone has to manage the wheat fields. Someone has to boss the servants. And someone has to side-eye the treasury when a cousin forgets the loan repayment. That someone is the wife. One fringe tale tells of a Spartan woman who, upon hearing a male magistrate question her land ownership, removed her sandal and gently slapped him across the face, an act both legally daring and fashionably bold. The magistrate said nothing. He knew better. Historians still argue whether these empowered roles were true feminist triumphs or just survival hacks created by absentee husbands. Either way, Spartan women had legal weight and muscles. They were trained to be fit, articulate, and just sarcastic enough to terrify Athenian diplomats. Meanwhile, in Viking society, women could inherit land, manage farms, and wield influence when their husbands were off raiding or becoming local legends via acts. There's even documentation of female heads of household called husfreya, literally, the house lady, who were respected figures in court proceedings and community decisions. She'd host feasts, settle minor disputes, and look very calmly at anyone who tried to borrow a cow without asking. And don't mistake this for domestic bliss. These households were political units, economic engines, and occasionally emotional endurance trials. A Viking husband might be legally permitted to discipline household members, but if his wife caught wind of it being unfair, she could file a legal complaint. Or worse, shame him publicly at the next feast, which, in Viking terms, is the equivalent of being unfollowed by Thor. One peculiar note: Spartan marriages were oddly sneaky. Newlywed men were expected to sneak into their wives' homes at night for secret visits, often for years. Daylight cuddling, not state approved. Scholars still debate whether this was ritualized self-restraint or the ancient equivalent of he's just not that emotionally available. So here you sit, watching two worlds in parallel: one where mom carries the keys, and one where mom owns the farm and the mortgage. Both powerful, both legally complex, both mildly terrifying. And in both, you do not lose an argument to your mother. Not unless you enjoy sleeping outside. In winter, you're 7 years old, which in most societies means cake and awkward teeth. But in Sparta, congratulations, you're no longer considered a child. You are now government property. The state gently but firmly removes you from your family and drops you into the agora, the famously charming system of education that involves wrestling, starvation, more wrestling, and learning how to survive with nothing but a cloak and judgmental stares. Here, your parents wave you off like you're going to summer camp, except this one includes spear drills and possibly fighting a wolf. The philosophy: a child raised by the state is loyal to the state. The family becomes a kind of biological footnote. Historians still argue whether this system was truly about national unity or simply a convenient way to avoid paying for daycare. Now hop over to Viking country. No cloaks, no wolf fights, just Uncle Einar teaching you to swing a sword between bedtime stories. Viking families didn't send their kids off to be reprogrammed. They just raised them with the helpful assistance of cousins, aunts, the neighbor's goat, and whoever was still standing after the last mead-fueled feast. Parenting was a community effort. And by community, we mean everyone with a pulse and an opinion. One fringe tale mentions a Viking child who was unofficially raised by his grandmother, 3 unrelated warriors, and a one-eyed seer who claimed the boy would one day marry a swan. No one questioned it. He did end up marrying someone who acted like a swan. So it sort of worked out. Spartan children, on the other hand, didn't get multiple bedtime influences. They got one doctrine: obedience, discipline, and stealth. Mothers were expected to let go, emotionally and legally. Fathers, they were more like state-appointed cheerleaders with military caps. Some historians claim Spartans were discouraged from forming deep bonds with their children. lest they interfere with their loyalty to the state. Family dinners, not a thing. Unless you count communal broth and passive-aggressive staring. Meanwhile, in a Viking hall, young boys and girls both learned household skills, weapon handling, and saga recitation. Being able to tell a story was almost as valuable as knowing how to fight, because when your aunt survives a bear attack, someone has to immortalize that in verse. Children were legally tied to the household, not the state, and if they misbehaved, the punishment usually involved extra chores, an icy glare, or, in extreme cases, being declared fjarlaus, literally without rights until they shaped up. That might sound intense, but compared to Spartan kids being whipped publicly to build character, the Viking timeout corner feels practically luxurious. Spartan girls didn't get a free pass either. Though they weren't shoved into the agora, they were expected to train in athletics to bear strong sons. They also sang battle songs, loudly, in front of the boys. Some say this was empowering. Others say it was psychological warfare wrapped in a lullaby. So as you nestle under your blanket tonight, consider this in one world. Your bedtime story might involve Odin and longboats. In the other, it's don't cry, or you'll be sent back to the wild. Sleep tight, young warrior. The state is watching. You rub your temples and try to follow the wedding seating chart. But it reads more like a military campaign than a family tree. That's because both Viking and Spartan societies had a very collaborative definition of marriage. Not just love and partnership, more like legal alliance, wealth transfer, and, occasionally, a bizarre solution for estate management. In short, weddings were binding, emotionally debatable. Legally, oh, absolutely. In Viking lands, marriage was less about romantic candlelight and more about who gets the goats. A formal engagement, called festermal, involved a negotiation between families, usually brokered over ale, side eyes, and a serious discussion of livestock. Fathers spoke, mothers glared, and if the deal was good enough, two people who barely knew each other became a legally recognized team. But the real twist, if a Viking man died, his brother or sometimes cousin was expected to step in and marry the widow. This charming custom, called levirati marriage, was less awe and more you again. It ensured property stayed in the family, and more importantly, that the widow didn't end up alone with 12 sheep and no legal muscle. One fringe tale tells of a woman who had 3 husbands, all brothers, none of whom made it through raiding season. Eventually, she married a merchant. The sheep survived. Historians still argue whether these sibling switches empowered women or just made their family dinners extremely awkward. Meanwhile, in Sparta, the marriage game was no less strategic, just colder and far more state-approved. Spartan men were encouraged to marry later, around age 30, once they were full citizens. But Spartan girls married off around 18 often, through arrangements that read like sports drafts. Eugenics. You ask, not quite, but not eugenics. The state had opinions on breeding strong offspring, and if that meant orchestrating a few double partner pairings, so be it. One particularly eyebrow-raising custom allowed older men to loan their wives to younger, stronger men for the sake of high-quality babies. And the state said, excellent idea. You'd never think love and long-term reproductive outsourcing would go hand in hand. But this is Sparta. There's even a fringe account of a Spartan bride who lived in a separate house and only saw her husband during secret nighttime visits, allegedly to preserve military discipline. Romance by moonlight, sanctioned by bureaucracy. And yes, in both societies, polyamory wasn't unheard of. Vikings, for instance, had semi-legalized concubinage. Not wives, not quite mistresses, more like long-term guests with a side of inheritance chaos. In Sparta, it was less about the number of partners and more about the lineage. The goal wasn't a happy home. It was strong babies. Or, in one story, a baby born with a six-pack. Even divorce laws had their quirks. Viking women could divorce a husband for reasons including unmanly behavior or repeated failures to maintain the household. That's right, if he didn't fix the roof, or, say, acted like a drama queen in public, he could be legally dismissed. Spartan women didn't even need a public reason. Just a quiet word, a legal form, and a firm goodbye. So, as you imagine yourself at one of these weddings, standing beside a sheet, a scroll, and your soon-to-be legal partner, remember it's not the flowers or the vows that matter. It's whether the inheritance paperwork is signed in triplicate. You're standing outside a Viking longhouse at dusk, and someone just dumped their teenage son's boots in the snow. Not an accident. This is a message, because tonight, that child has been legally unchilded. Welcome to the cheery Norse concept of disowning your own offspring like they're expired cheese, no courtroom, no warning. Just exile via doorstep symbolism and deeply passive-aggressive shoe placement. Under Viking law, a parent could declare a child an utlager, outlawed and legally unprotected by performing certain public rituals, like placing the child's possessions outside, or reciting a specific legal phrase 3 times in front of witnesses. Basically, a magical incantation to delete your kid. You'd think grounding would be enough, but apparently, some people really hated sharing their mead. The reasons ranged from petty theft to repeated dishonor to, you guessed it, failing to pull your weight on the farm. One fringe tale tells of a boy disowned for refusing to stop playing the lyre during harvest. His father reportedly shouted, "Then go live with your music," and threw the instrument after him. The boy eventually became a traveling bard. So, awkward win. Historians still argue whether this was discipline gone wild or just an ancient version of kicking someone off the family Netflix plan. Meanwhile, down in Sparta, things were handled with less flair and more annihilation. Spartan children weren't typically disowned because they technically didn't belong to their parents in the first place. But if a boy failed the agora, their brutal, state-run education system, he didn't just disappoint mom and dad. He was effectively erased from society, stripped of citizen status, exiled internally. You still lived in Sparta, but now you were invisible. These failed trainees were known as tremblers, and let's just say their social calendar got real quiet, real fast. No voting, no landowning, definitely no wife. Fringe accounts describe tremblers being hissed at in the streets like cursed house cats. But here's the twist. While Sparta erased people for not measuring up physically, Viking society gave room for personal redemption. Kind of. A disowned Viking child could, in theory, prove themselves through great deeds rescuing a village, slaying a sea serpent, writing a very impressive saga, and have their name restored. Conditional family membership, brought to you by trauma. In both cultures, parental authority was absolute, but so was consequence. A Viking parent could shame a child into social ruin, and a Spartan father could lose his son not to death, but to dishonor, which was worse. At least a dead son might get a funeral, and yet, even with these harsh laws, families remained vital. Being disowned was serious not just emotionally, but economically. You lost legal protection, inheritance rights, and maybe most tragically, your place at the feast table. One Viking law even declared that a disowned child couldn't be avenged if killed. That's right. No blood feuds. No compensation. Society treated you like expired milk. Sad, but very shelf-stable. So, as you curl under your blanket tonight, give your family a silent thank you for only threatening to take your phone, not your legal identity. And remember, in Viking times, failing to do your chores could get you unsonned before supper. You enter a candlelit hall and find a family of strangers who are legally adopting a 35-year-old man. Not because they love him, not because they need company, but because their goat farm needs a new heir, and Cousin Harold is terrible with ledgers. Welcome to adoption in Viking and Spartan societies, where it was less about cuddles and more about contracts, land, and the occasional revenge plot. In Viking society, adoption wasn't really about giving a child a home. It was a tool sharp, legal, and frequently opportunistic. You could adopt a full-grown adult, especially if they had skills, swords, or extremely loyal dogs. The goal: keep wealth in the family, maintain your legacy, and block that one cousin you hate from inheriting everything. There's one fringe tale about a man who adopted his drinking buddy solely to spite his brother. The brother got nothing. The buddy got a farm, 3 boats, and a very confused set of in-laws. Historians still argue whether this was noble estate planning or just Viking-level pettiness. Adopted children had the same rights as biological heirs, but the process had rules. It needed witnesses, a formal declaration, and often a feast. Yes, That's right. You couldn't finalize an adoption without at least a few roasted birds and enough ale to make everybody forget who the original heirs were. Spartans also used adoption for political ends, but with a twist of elite paranoia. If a Spartan aristocrat didn't have sons, he might adopt a relative or even an outsider if they were strong, loyal, and properly terrifying. The adopted heir inherited not just property, but status. And in a society obsessed with bloodlines and military glory, this was no small gamble. One fringe account tells of a powerful Spartan who adopted a rival's son to secure peace between families. It worked. Until the boy grew up and seized both estates in a move that made Game of Thrones look like kindergarten. Scholars still debate whether this was a brilliant alliance or just history's most awkward Thanksgiving. In both cultures, adoption had ripple effects. In Viking lands, adopted sons could become chieftains, leaders, even saga heroes. But if they betrayed their new family, legal doom, contracts could be revoked, names stricken from memory. No second chances once you've ruined the roast goose and the family legacy. Spartan adoptions were less flexible. Once an heir was chosen, it was final. Even if he turned out to be less brave hoplite and more enthusiastic flute player. The family had to commit. The state approved adoptions, and once stamped. There was no refund policy. Hope you like the flute. Adoption also played into military service. A Spartan with no biological sons might adopt a promising young warrior, ensuring that someone carried his shield and his pension. But again, it wasn't about love. It was about utility, which sounds cold, because it was. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine being adopted at 42 because you bake great bread and have excellent spear technique. Forget diapers. Think deeds. Forget lullabies. Think land titles. Because in these worlds, family wasn't who raised you. It was who could legally outmaneuver everyone else. You've just walked into a family gathering where everyone is armed, some with knives, others with legal scrolls. Welcome to the heartwarming concept of the family feud, Viking and Spartan edition. Here, I'm never speaking to you again. Might also mean I'm challenging you to a legally sanctioned axe duel. Because in both societies, resolving domestic disputes meant either going to court or going to war, and sometimes both. In Viking culture, if your uncle insulted your honor, you didn't vent in a journal. You filed a lawsuit or unsheathed your sword. Feuds were governed by gragas, the old law codes, which actually outlined how revenge should work. Step 1, announce your grievance. Step 2, negotiate compensation. Step 3, if that fails, gather your cousins and pick a field. You'd never think that justice and violence could be part of a respectable family tradition, but here we are. In fact, blood feuds weren't just allowed, they were expected. If someone killed your brother and you didn't retaliate, your entire family risked social humiliation. Nothing says bedtime stories like, Grandpa didn't avenge Uncle Rurik, and now no one invites us to feasts. One fringe tale describes a man who sued his brother-in-law over a lost sheep and ended up in a 20-year feud that involved 2 weddings, 3 accidental stabbings, and 1 unfortunate goat explosion. Historians still argue whether feuds were mechanisms of justice or just ancient Viking reality TV. Spartans were less about blood feuds and more about controlled honor-based drama. Public shaming was a legit legal tool. If your cousin disgraced the family, you could haul them in front of the Aphors, Sparta's 5-man government council and demand they be publicly humiliated. Options included fines, exile, or a good old-fashioned ritual mocking. Sometimes a chorus was involved. Very musical, very legal. And while Spartans didn't usually kill each other over insults, they did believe in defending family honor through, let's call it, structured aggression. Disputes between clans were often solved with competitions athletics, debate, or occasionally choreographed verbal roasting. One fringe account tells of a woman who insulted her sister-in-law's weaving, prompting a full legal case and a very tense textile showcase. Even children weren't immune. In Viking culture, if a young boy was insulted by an adult, his family could demand compensation or challenge the offender to a duel on his behalf. Imagine showing up to school with your dad in full chainmail, just in case the math teacher gets lippy. Spartan children were taught from a young age to respond to insults with wit, not whining, being called weak. Respond with a joke so cutting it becomes folklore. If you cried, you weren't just mocked, you were legally disrespected. There are actual records of children being removed from elite schools for failing to verbally retaliate fast enough. Talk about savage report cards. In both cultures, families had legal teams, often made of relatives who supported their side in disputes. So yes, Thanksgiving dinner involved a lot of side eyes, but also possibly a notary public and someone holding a spear. So as you lie there tonight, safe from poetic insults and dueling cousins, remember, in the Viking and Spartan world, family didn't just mean love and loyalty. It meant knowing exactly how to sue your nephew. In verse, you're crouched beside a cradle, carved from pine, or maybe marble, listening to the chanting of names. Not nursery rhymes, not baby babble, just names. Old ones, heavy ones. Welcome to the pressure-packed world of Viking and Spartan naming laws, where giving a baby the wrong name wasn't just bad taste, it could be legally contested, socially disastrous, and occasionally laughed out of the village. In Viking society, naming wasn't a matter of preference, it was a system of legacy engineering. A child's name had to connect them to an ancestor, often a famous warrior or matriarch, as if the name itself had magical Wi-Fi that linked the kid to past deeds. So, if great-grandpa Styrbjorn slayed 12 men and fell into a cauldron of honey during battle, congratulations, your toddler is now Styrbjorn. Please ignore the sticky connotations. One fringe tale tells of a boy named after two ants and an ancestor's prized cow. His name took two breaths to say. His nickname was Help. Historians still argue whether Viking names were acts of reverence or just glorified identity theft. And don't think you could just freestyle a name. Laws in some regions actually forbade naming a child before they survived a certain number of days, usually 8. That's when the official naming feast, the Naftfester, occurred. During this event, the father held a child on his knee. Water was sprinkled, a name was declared, and everyone clapped, relieved the baby hadn't disqualified itself by sneezing too hard. Names carried legal implications. A child named after a landowning ancestor might automatically gain claims to property. But if you messed it up, if you accidentally named your son after someone from the wrong AETT family line, you could trigger inheritance disputes, family shame, and a 5-page passive-aggressive saga. In Sparta, the name game was less whimsical, more militarized. Boys were often named after grandfathers or renowned warriors, while girls' names tied into fertility, strength, or ominously specific gods. There was a narrow pool of approved names, and going off script was frowned upon. You weren't raising a child. You were branding a product for civic duty. One particularly fringe tale involves a Spartan boy named Glory to the Sword, who became a poet. His father reportedly tried to rename him Glory to the Backhand, but the state said no name per citizen, no exchanges. Spartan naming wasn't just personal, it was political. Names marked your clan, your status, even your access to certain religious roles or military ranks. Being named wrong could delay your entry into the agora, bar you from festivals, or worse, confuse the record-keeping scribes. No one wants to be the boy who missed war because someone misread the vowels. Historians still debate whether this strict naming system preserved social order or stifled individuality before a child could even walk. Either way, your name was destiny. And destiny did not rhyme with moonbeam. In both cultures, nicknames eventually bloomed, some affectionate, some legally recognized, and some deeply unfortunate. There's a Viking saga featuring a man nicknamed Sealtooth. Why, no one knows. Possibly dental. Possibly he bit a seal. He died rich and respected, so it clearly worked out. So as you whisper your own name tonight, tucked under a blanket that nobody else had to earn by wrestling a bear, be glad at least you didn't get named after a dead aunt, a dairy cow, and your father's tax loophole. You're walking now, slowly, through the still hush of a burial ground where stones lean with time and memory. The air smells of cold earth and something older, maybe obligation. Because here, the dead don't just rest. They continue to collect, demand, and occasionally sue. Welcome to the afterlife clause in Viking and Spartan family law, where even the grave couldn't cancel your to-do list. In Viking tradition, death was not a break, it was a transition. Property didn't just pass to the living, it passed according to detailed, spoken wills, often recited around the fire with witnesses who absolutely were not allowed to nod off. If someone skipped a name or mispronounced a clause, it could unravel the whole deal. Yes, even beyond the grave. Grandpa still micromanaged the sheep. Many burials included tools, weapons, jewelry, and sometimes written contracts or rune stones indicating inheritances. If these weren't honored, trouble followed. One fringe tale tells of a Viking family cursed by the ghost of an uncle, whose burial feast was undercatered. No lamb, no peace. They eventually held a second funeral with double portions. The haunting stopped. Historians still argue whether this was superstition, legal tradition, or a very aggressive Yelp review from beyond the veil. In Sparta, the dead also had expectations. They were honored with rituals that maintained social structure even after death. If your father was a war hero, you didn't just get his shield, you inherited the legal responsibility to uphold his name. This included appearing at public festivals, contributing to ceremonies, and maintaining his grave. Failing to do so could bring disgrace and, depending on the circumstances, legal consequences. Spartan families also had specific burial laws. Only men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were given engraved tombstones. Everyone else a humble marker, if that. This practice was less about grief and more about making sure only state-approved sacrifice was remembered in stone. Talk about exclusive memorial policies. There's one fringe account of a Spartan woman who faked her own death in childbirth just to qualify for a named tombstone. It worked. The deception wasn't discovered for years, possibly because her husband was busy training and emotionally unavailable. And let's not forget ancestor worship. Both cultures believed the dead influenced the living. You didn't just inherit property, you inherited a moral debt. If you didn't honor Grandma properly, she might ruin your crops. If you ignored Great Uncle Bercie's burial instructions, enjoy your cursed livestock. Even disputes could continue after death. Vikings had the concept of nid, or verbal curses, that could affect the standing of a dead relative's soul. These were sometimes legally countered with poetry, yes. Actual counter-litigation via verse. That's right, Your Honor. I present Exhibit B, a 17-stanza saga. As you ease into sleep, imagine a world where ghosts read contracts, ancestors require upkeep, and dinner with the dead isn't symbolic, it's legally binding. And now, the wind down. Wind down. Let the story soften now. Let the names drift away like candle smoke curling over old stones. The halls are quiet. The feasts are done. The swords are sheathed. And all those family laws, those strange, sharp. Ancient codes fade into gentle whispers. No more inspections. No inheritance to manage. Just the hush of night and the comfort of knowing your name is yours alone, untouched by warriors, scribes, or wandering goats. Sleep well. Air of no obligations. The ancestors are resting